Welcome to the Dollar Commander Podcast. My name is Martin.
And I'm Eric.
Dollar Commander Podcast is a budget-focused Commander podcast. We firmly believe you don't need to spend a lot of money to have fun. We'll be going over important cards and interesting commanders that don't break the bank. Specifically today, we're going to be discussing our top 10 budget cards you can find reprinted in Mystery Booster. This is a set that made its debut at conventions and Magic Fests before Wizards formally released a retail version for people to purchase. And there's a lot of amazing reprints that we got, really cool old cards, and the good news is that some of those old cards and some of the lesser old cards, the prices have come down quite a bit because there's just more of them out there. And we're going to be talking about a lot of these really cool finds.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Mystery Boosters is Wizards' attempt to sort of represent the Chaos Draft style, where you pull from a bunch of different card pools and you piece together a deck from all cards all across Magic's history. So it's really cool, and I think it really leads to a lot of really neat reprints that really ended up tanking price. There are a lot of cards reprinted in Mystery Booster, but it still managed to cut the price of these things down significantly because there were a few cards that were reprinted that were only expensive because there was only one printing of them. So it's definitely slashed a lot of prices, and I think that's really good for budget Commander players like us.
Yeah, and it really is kind of a mishmash of like different mechanics and themes. There's not like a specific way to play it, right? Like for those people who want to draft it. Or make a sealed deck, right? It's just kind of all the stuff is sort of good in its own way, and you might have the support for it, you might not, but I think that's part of the appeal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you get to preview some just insane Magic cards from like 20 years ago that you had no idea existed until now, and that's always the fun part of Chaos Draft, is trying to piece together something and trying to make sense of something. But yeah, no, it's really cool. I'm really excited that they did this product, and I hope that we start to see more things like it.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that each one of them does have a foil box topper, and there were some exclusive, I guess, toppers, right? And so some of those cards, including some really cool commanders, those have come down in price. So yeah, it's a win for commander players. It's a big win for budget commander players because these prices are coming down quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a top 10. We're gonna talk about those cards, and then we'll also mention very quickly a list of other cards that you should look out for or pick up to add into your decks. Let's start with number 10. Like Eric was mentioning earlier, a lot of these cards are very old. People may not be familiar with them at all. And number 10 is very much that type of card. It's Energy Field, which is 1 in a blue. It's an enchantment. It reads, prevent all damage that would be dealt to you by sources you don't control. When a card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, sacrifice Energy Field. This is a rare that was last printed in Urza's Saga. And it's surprisingly not on the reserved list, so here we are. We've got it reprinted in Mystery Booster.
Yeah, it was reprinted, but it was reprinted with a gold border in the World Championship deck, and that's not a real printing, so we're not going to count it. But Energy Field is a really unique card that is really good at stopping enemy attacks and enemy damage spells, and is really good at protecting you, with the caveat that the massive downside of having a card getting put into your graveyard, destroying the energy field. Now, cards go in your graveyard super easily, as I'm sure you guys know. Sorceries go in your graveyard after you cast them, instants, and if any of your creatures or enchantments or artifacts get blown up, they also go in the graveyard and destroy energy field. So it's a really steep build around, but I think something that is really good if you can get rolling.
Yeah, it's extremely fragile, right? This is your House of Cards kind of effect, but it only costs 2 mana, which is is really attractive. And I think what you can do some really cool stuff here. There are several cards, like Teferi comes to mind, where you can play spells as instants. There's the blue ley line, but there's other spells and effects.
Teferi, Mage of Zhalfir, right?
Yeah, and I think there's even there might even be a couple of Planeswalker Teferis, which those aren't very budget. All the same, there are going to be ways where you can sneak this out, or if you already have it on the battlefield and your opponent is about to destroy or target something, there are ways you can protect the field either by bouncing it back to your hand. You can flicker the energy field and bring it back onto battlefield. And if you're playing it with other colors, like with white or green perhaps, you can bring enchantments back from your graveyard onto the battlefield. So it is a little bit of a build around. I don't think it's going to be a major piece to a specific commander deck, but I think it does help for folks who don't like creature heavy decks, or perhaps their commander is kind of a beefier commander that they're not going to get out until turn 5, 6, 7. Energy field is kind of there to sort of protect you in a bubble.
I think you really want exiling cards with this. So if you're in black and you have cards that exile cards instead of hitting the graveyard. One card I really like that combos with Energy Field is a card called Rest in Peace, which is well known amongst Commander players for completely shutting down graveyards. Rest in Peace says that if a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, it gets exiled instead. And that instead is really important because it doesn't break up the energy field because a card's never technically put into your graveyard. So I really think you want to be playing it with those types of graveyard entering replacement effects, which ensure that it prevents all the damage to you, and it's very hard to stop it unless they go about removing all your other permanents first. So yeah, it's a really interesting card, and I think one that has a lot of potential, and has had a lot of potential to build around.
Yeah, it's quirky and fun. There are a few other cards that work well, but they're not necessarily budget cards. Wheel of Sun and Moon is a way of basically whenever a card goes to your graveyard, put it on the bottom of the library. I guess buyback spells that would work. So if you had buyback spells, they'll never make it to the graveyard. Obviously, like Brago, King Eternal, where you can flicker your permanents might be a way. Or a lot of those kind of like slow flicker effects where like it goes away and then comes back in end of turn would allow you to cast spells. White has a lot of ways to get enchantments back from your graveyard.
So number 9 is a card called Martyrs Bond. It's 4 white for an enchantment that says, whenever Martyrs Bond or another non-land permanent you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a permanent that shares a card type with it. Now, this card was also reprinted recently in the Gideon signature spellbook, which also managed to tank the price, because I think this card was like $9-10 at its most expensive when it was printed first back in Commander 2011. But well-timed reprints with mystery boosters and Gideon have reduced this price down to 40 cents, which is insane for what this card does. So I like to look at this card like a white Grave Pact, where if you can sacrifice your own things, and then they get put into your graveyard, and then your opponents need to do the same thing with the things that you sacrificed. They also need to sacrifice a permanent of the same type. So you can differentiate this between something like Karmic Justice, because Karmic Justice cares about who puts it in the graveyard, but Martyrs Bond does not. So you can sacrifice any permanent, and your opponents have to do the same thing. So if you have something like a Seal of Cleansing that reads, sacrifice Seal of Cleansing, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and you sacrifice Seal of Cleansing, not only do you get to pop an artifact or enchantment, but that means each other opponent needs to sacrifice an enchantment as well. So I think white decks will really love this, and I think any Aristocrats deck that's in white should seriously consider playing this, especially if you don't have access to Grave Pact, which is still like an $11 card, or a Dictate of Erebos, which is a $7 card.
Yeah, I mean, immediately I think of creature tokens, right? You know, if you've got a very heavy creature token deck with a sack outlet, I mean, basically just, sack off these useless tokens, and eventually your opponent's going to have to sacrifice their most powerful creatures.
Teza Orzhov Scion. makes a lot of tokens and has a sacrifice outlet on the commander itself. So you can really just like suddenly turn your small token army into a board wrath, a one-sided board wrath, just through the use of this card. So if you see an opponent play this, you really want to get rid of it quickly before it takes over the game, much like something like Grave Pact.
Yeah, Aylee Eternal Pilgrim is another one, white black, where you can pay as little as 1 mana to sacrifice another creature. There's quite a lot there. I think it's sort of like harkens back to like the balance effects, right? That old balance card that said, hey, everyone needs to have the same number of permanents, and so this is kind of evening out or flattening out what people have. Cards that could be sacrificed to fetch things. So, for example, artifacts, like I'm thinking of like Armillary Sphere, where you can sacrifice the artifact to get some basic lands. Another one is Burnished Heart, where, sacrifice it, get some lands, and that's a good way for whittling down your opponent's artifacts.
Exactly, and if you sacrifice Burnished Heart, that means that your opponents need to either sacrifice a creature or an artifact, which gives this card even further reach. Even with something like Steve, Securo Tribe Elder, that sacrifices itself to get a land, you can do that at instant speed, and suddenly it's an instant speed edict, where each opponent needs to sacrifice a creature as well. So there's a lot of really neat applications for this card, and I think that now that it's much, much cheaper than it used to be, I think you're going to start running into this card a lot more.
Our number 8 is Angelic Destiny. Angelic Destiny is an aura. Enchanted creature gets +4/+4, has flying and first strike, and is an angel in addition to its other types. When enchanted creature dies, return Angelic Destiny to its owner's hand. Costs 2 white. Last printed in Magic 2012. Obviously, pretty cool way to buff a creature. Flying and first strike are excellent as far as combat abilities to kind of push through to your opponent. The icing here, the crown jewel, is being able to return Angelic Destiny to your hand and recast it. It is only when it dies, but again, I think sacrifice outlets, if your creature is going to get exiled, if your extremely annoying opponent is about to Cyclonic Rift, whenever your creature dies, you can save and replay this card.
It's hard to think of a Voltron deck that doesn't want something like this. The problem with auras is that when the creature dies, you eventually get 3-for-1, 4-for-1 with all your auras that attach to that creature, unless you have something to grab it back. But with Angelic Destiny, what you can do is you can really just keep replaying this, make any of your creatures huge, and have a lot of relevant keywords. And then when that creature dies, just grab it right back and replay it on another creature, which makes this card really hard to remove unless your opponent dedicates a removal spell like a Disenchant to it. So I think Angelic Destiny is a really good card and has always been a really good card, and has sort of suffered from what I mentioned during the intro, where it only received 1 printing and it's a high-in-demand commander card. But now that it's been reprinted in mystery boosters, it's now at $176 in price, which is much more affordable, and I think puts this in perfect range for being played. I think this card's going to see a lot of play in a lot of Voltron decks, and just a lot of decks that really want to be swinging in with their creatures.
How about Infect?
Oh God!
And Infect cards, right?
But you mentioned Infect, and something I'm thinking of is a commander called Rafik of the Many, which is 1 in Bant, and whenever a creature attacks alone, it gives that creature double strike. And it has the Exalted keywords, which gives it +1/+1. So if you play this on something like a Glistener Elf, attach Angelic Destiny to it, and then swing in with Glistener Elf with Rafik of the Many on board, the Glistener Elf gets pumped +1/+1, gets pumped +4/+4, gets double strike until end of turn. That kills your opponent straight away. So if you have that combination on board, you can pretty quickly kill someone. And I think that's what makes Angelic Destiny so cool, is that you can give it to just a small creature and turn it into a really big threat, and you can keep doing that because of its ability to self-recur.
couple other commanders I really like it with. Bruna, Light of Alabaster, so hey, if it does fall into the graveyard, you can get it back. Siona, we were waxing about Siona here in one of the last podcasts. Mm-hmm. If you have it attached to an aura and then the creature dies, you can just recast the aura, and then Siona will keep triggering, so that's really cool. If you want to take your hand at mono white, there are mono white spells that really like these sort of effects. Quende, Pride Ephemeref, that's like uncommon legendary creatures from Dominaria. Creatures with first strike have double strike. Now all of a sudden you've got this angel that's double striking. I think it's utilitarian, and it can find its way into quite a few number of decks.
Yeah, absolutely. So our number 7 is a card called Helm of Awakening. It's a 2-mana artifact. Really simple text. You're not going to have to dedicate a lot of memory to memorizing this. Spells cost 1 less to cast. Just every spell that you can cast costs 1 less to cast. Really simple effect, but it can go in a lot of different places. If your deck really wants to be casting a bunch of spells in one turn, like an aggro strategy or a storm deck, it's a really good rock to have in your mana rock lineup. It does reduce your opponent's cost as well, so you really need to use this quickly and use it to put high pressure on your opponents, especially if your deck already is running low to the ground. But I think Helm of Awakening, now that it's been reprinted, can be used in a lot of different strategies and be used very well by those strategies.
It's interesting because, Visions. I mean, this is like, 96? I mean, I might have one of these cards from back then, but really cool. Right, pretty much any deck, and especially a deck where you're playing a lot of spells in a turn, you can instantly make these a lot cheaper. I guess it could combo with certain kinds of cards where you're casting really cheap artifacts. One thing to be aware of here, this is a global effect, right? So this affects everybody.
This helps your opponents, yeah.
Maybe group hug decks would kind of like this. Here you go, guys. Everything's cheaper. Lay off me for a while. So kind of fun. Certainly it helps quite a bit on if you've got like that Hope of Girapur deck, if you've got a colorless commander. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to get extra mana, right? Don't have access to green or red to sort of pump up your mana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually found out about this card. I owned one before it was reprinted, and it was in my group hug deck, and it's always been really good there. Especially, I think it could be even good in artifact decks if you are running a lot of one-drop artifact creatures like Arcbound Worker or Bomat Courier, for instance. I think that this gets additional value if you can suddenly make those cards into Ornithopter effects, and then you can suddenly be casting out a bunch of these in return. You can be casting a lot of these cards for free.
There are quite a few commanders here that we've seen recently that will also reduce your mana cost, like Thrix, the Sudden Storm, that's that mono blue flash flying. We've also got Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. So, just making things even ever more cheaper. There's obviously like a lot of historic tie-in. Just if you have an artifact and other artifacts are cheaper. Joyra, Teshar. So there's quite a few out there.
Yeah, play it in your egg decks and make your incredibly cheap eggs even cheaper, and let you cast a bunch of them in a turn. This could perfectly slot into any Joyra Weatherlight Captain style of deck where you're trying to pump out a bunch of artifacts all in one turn and draw a bunch of cards. Yeah, Helm of Awakening could just be fantastic in there, and it could really tie together a deck.
Mm-hmm. Number 6 is Knollspine Dragon. Knollspine Dragon is a 7/5 dragon for 5 red. It has flying. When Knollspine Dragon enters the battlefield, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. What's not to like about this? I guess the mana cost, but 79 cents. Used to cost quite a bit more. We're talking like over $7. What's your take here, Eric?
Well, I would play this card if it was a 7-mana sorcery that just said, discard your hand, draw cards equal to the amount of damage you dealt to an opponent this turn. But the fact that you get this on a 7/5 flying dragon is insane. This card has been really good. I used to play one in my Rurik Thard deck. When you're doing a lot of damage like that, you can sort of run out of all your spells because you exhausted all your cards from your hand and put them onto the battlefield. But what Knollspine does is it lets you completely restock while still continuing your board presence, and really makes it so that your opponents need to kill you or get rid of your board very soon, or else you'll just completely take over the game. Not to mention the fact that this is an enter the battlefield ability, so you can flicker it and reuse its ability. Yeah, this card's fantastic, and I think that the fact that it was reprinted and its price got so low makes it really good for any red deck that's just does a lot of damage but really needs a way to sort of keep its wheels turning. So yeah, I've always been a big fan of Knollspine Dragon, and I'm really happy to see it get reprinted.
I think the big thing here is just it's all about card draw, right? I mean, Commander is very big about you need to get resources in your hand, and what's really fantastic about this, red typically has the replace your hand kind of effects, right? I mean, the classic Wheel of Fortune, but more recent versions, like there's some Chandra ones where you get one extra card if you've done your math correctly. And you had that big burn spell, or you've attacked in with the weakest opponent. You can easily get from 1 or 2 cards in your hand, to 7, 8, 9 cards. So just the fact that it can quickly ramp your hand up is fantastic. I have a Neheb the Eternal deck that I really love. It's the mono red from Hour of Devastation, where at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, just add a red mana to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So you get in for a lot of damage, you get a lot of mana, you can play Knollspine Dragon for possibly, for free, right? If you got all this mana in, hit for 7, get 7 mana, play Knollspine Dragon, and draw 7 cards. Like,
yeah.
That's nuts. And, I suppose if you had blue here, you could easily flicker it, right? I mean, blue or white, you could flicker the dragon, comes back into the battlefield, draw more cards.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have cards with flashback and they're in your hand, obviously you can keep casting those from your graveyard. I guess I could see this go into certain decks that want to utilize the graveyard as a resource, but I think primarily it's just big flyer, big dragons, and lots of cards, right?
Mm-hmm. Play it in your Dragon Tribal deck, play it in your damage dealing deck. If your deck wants to win by doing a bunch of damage, I don't see a reason why you don't play this card. It's really good.
Bladewing the Risen is one of the cheapest commanders you can find. 35 cents. It's been reprinted quite a bit, and it combos with this beautifully. It does cost a lot of mana to get out, but when it enters the battlefield, return a target dragon permanent card from the graveyard to the battlefield. So, if you get out, Knollspine Dragon, recast Bladewing, get it back on the battlefield.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rakdos, Lord of Riots, is another one where, dealing damage to your opponent. Yeah, there's quite a few commanders out there this will work great with.
Mm-hmm. Red has a lot of creature copy effects by itself. I mean, we have like Twin Flame, which can create a copy of a creature. Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker, if you're playing him as a commander, it just goes insane with Knollspine Dragon. So yeah, I think the more copies that you can make of this card, the more you can be wheeling your hand. You can really create this gigantic momentum and be able to win the game very quickly if your opponents let it go unchecked. So yeah, great card. Love it. Alright, so our number 5 card is a card called Wheel of Fate. Speaking of wheeling your hand, here's another red card that lets you draw tons of cards. So this one's a little bit weird. It doesn't have a mana cost, but it does have Suspend 4, which means that for 2 mana, 1 red and 1 generic, you can pay it and then exile it, and then put 4 time counters on it, and then you take off a time counter at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, and then when the last is removed, you can cast it for free. And the card's really simple. Each player discards their hand, draws 7 cards. This card is an echo of a card called Wheel of Fortune, which has the same effect of each player discarding their hand and then draw 7 cards. I think I like this better, which is really weird to say because this is intended to be a downgrade. But I think the fact that you can pay into in advance and sort of set up by either playing out all the cards in your hand, so making sure you're empty-handed by the time this thing resolves, or you can play with card draw prevention spells, like the Narset that got printed in War of the Spark. You could play it with Notion Thief or Alms Collector, and just completely empty your opponent's hands, and then draw all those cards. It can set you up really well, and it can mean that your opponents get left with nothing. And even if that doesn't happen, you still get a fresh 7. So Wheel of Fate's especially good, and I think it's really good in any red deck, especially a deck that can recur the things that you discard.
When you can cheat it out, it's even better, right? And there's going to be some cards, some commanders that will, like for example, Cascade with Yidris, where you can cast a card without paying its mana cost. And because there's no other way, when you have a card with no mana cost, you cannot cast it unless there's a spell or effect that will do it for you. But I think even for 2 mana, like, okay, 4 turns, that's all right. You can reload. When it happens, it's going to be happening on your turn, which means that you're going to get to cast your cards before other players.
Yeah, so this card you can cheat it out with things like Wildfire Eternal or Omnispell Adept. Even if you can't, though, it's just a really good spell to have on demand. Like you said, it wheels on your turn, and it means that you can keep all your mana up. So even if the spell gets put on the stack and someone tries to counter it, you can respond with your own counterspell, or you can stop your opponents from countering it.
Nekasar, Riel, which is a new commander here from Ikoria, and the Locust God, which was also reprinted. It still costs a lot of money, but it was reprinted in one of the commander decks. If you happen to get the commander deck with the Locust God in there, lots of draw synergies.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good alternative to Wheel of Fortune, which is just prohibitively expensive these days.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Wheel cards are really good. Especially the ones that let you draw back up to 7 are really good in Commander, and I think that the fact that this has been reprinted and is now well within budget range means that we get access to a really good effect for pretty cheap money-wise.
All right, so just a word of caution here. Some of these cards might be a little, controversial, unexpected. Keep in mind, these are cards that used to cost a lot of money, and they're extremely cheap now. So that's kind of the focus here. This one is one of those. It's Dragonlord Ojutai. Dragonlord Ojutai is 3 white-blue for a legendary creature Elder Dragon. It's flying. Dragonlord Ojutai has hexproof as long as it's untapped. Whenever Dragonlord Ojutai deals combat damage to a player, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. It's a 5/4. It's from Dragons of Tarkir. And it works as a really nice commander, and I think I honestly think it's a good starter commander for someone who might be new to the format. There's a couple things here that are really nice. One is that when you play Dragonlord Ojutai, it has hexproof. As long as no one counters it, it's not going to get destroyed. You're always going to get a chance to attack with it. As long as it's your turn, for the most part, at least up until your combat step. I mean, your opponents won't be able to touch it. And I think that's a common thing that beginners will always feel a little uncomfortable about, even though you can recast your commander. Just losing your commander kind of sucks. Imprisoning it with certain spells is also another way to contain a commander, and that's not going to be possible here much of the time. However, it still compels people to attack, which is good. If newer players don't want to lose stuff, they're going to be less incentivized to attack, but we've got this paragraph, right, where if it deals combat damage to a player, hey, guess what? You can basically draw a card from among the top 3. It's a selective card draw, essentially.
Dragonlord Ojutai is one of those Voltron commanders that does what I think Voltron commanders need to do, is that they need to keep up their momentum. I've mentioned it previously with Angelic Destiny that if you end up getting your commander removed and all your things fall off, then it can be a real problem to sort of rebuild. Dragonlord Ojutai prevents against that in 2 ways. It is hexproof as long as it's untapped, which means that if you give it vigilance by an effect, it's always hexproof, which is just insane on a commander. And you can constantly be using that anticipate effect to be constantly redrawing and constantly filling your hand with new Voltron abilities and protection spells and all that stuff, which means that this is a very potent commander. It was floating around like $8, and I think that's because a lot of people see the value of having such a self-protecting and advantage gaining commander in the command zone. So I think that if you're looking to build a Voltron deck and you want to do something a little bit different, or if you want to lean more into spells, or if you want to lean more into sustained card advantage, I think Dragonlord Ojutai is a really great pick, and I think that now that it's been reprinted and it's around like 250, I think it's now a really good time to try and build him.
I think you hit the nail on the head here, right? Like vigilance, right? Give your creature vigilance, or make it unblockable. Also, so that you can get through, whether it's just using Rogue's Passage or putting on an aura like Aqueous Form. Their blue obviously has quite a bit to untap stuff, especially at instant speed. We were talking about Stinging Lionfish on a previous podcast. This is an example where, hey, someone's about to target or destroy your commander. Okay, cast your spell, get it untapped. Dragonlord Ojutai is a very easy build around. It doesn't require a lot of effort to get a lot of effect out of it. With cards like Brave the Sands, where you can give all your stuff vigilance and just take advantage of cards, right? It's just all about drawing cards, getting answers. We have 100-card decks. Most games, we don't even see half of it, right? So, it's really just a matter of the more cards you see, the more answers you have, the faster that you can achieve victory.
And there's even a lot of ways in Azorius to sort of lean into that sustained card advantage. Imperial Armor, Imperial Plate, and Righteous Authority all have effects that give a creature a buff for the number of cards that you have in your hand. Imperial Armor actually was also reprinted in Mystery Boosters, which managed to reduce that card to a pretty bulk rate. The more cards that you can play that buff Ojutai while maintaining that card advantage is something that's going to be really important for building a good Ojutai deck, and I think that there's a lot of really budget ways to sort of access that and be able to maintain that inertia.
Card was somewhere between, I'd like to say $7 and $10. It's now just a little over $2, so it's come down quite a bit, and it's another dragon to put in your dragon deck too.
You can play it with Knollspine Dragon and just like drown in the card advantage.
All right, what's number 3?
So I'm really excited because I've always loved this card, and I think that now that it's gotten reprinted and now it's in a tolerable budget range, I'm really excited to try and play with it. It's a card named Maelstrom Archangel. It's one of every color, so that's white, blue, black, red, green, for an angel with flying, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can cast a non-land card from your hand without paying its mana cost. It's a 5/5 as well. This is... I'm a Johnny, and I tend to like these very techie cards, but this is the timmiest card ever, and I love it. I just love it so much. If you're playing it in a big mana 5-color deck like Joda, you can be running out a bunch of spells for free. If you are playing Gigantha, which is the new companion that adds one of every color of mana, you can run this out for free, swing in with it, and then drop something like Omniscience to just get all your spells to be free. It means that Maelstrom Archangel can be a really explosive card to build around. If you're playing with cards that give a double strike, you can put 2 permanents onto the battlefield. Yeah, this card's just really insane. 5 mana cost can be pretty daunting. If you're going to be playing one 5-color card in your 5-color deck that's not your commander, I think you should make it Maelstrom Archangel because it's an insane effect that's now super cheap to build around and a ton of fun.
Yeah, I like the card. It's going to be kind of hard because it's only going to work in those 5-color decks. Although, right, you were talking about Joda and Gigantha, and those are very inexpensive commanders to purchase. If you don't have a 5-color commander, you can start with one of those. Both of them are under 50 cents. There are more expensive commanders that are also available. Some of those we saw in like the commander. There's a commander deck with like all those dinosaurs in them. The dinosaurs, dragons,
Ur
all the
Dragon,
dragons
yeah.
in them.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ur-Dragon and Okagachi and Scion. Soothsay is another one that it's a white card, but it's got the 5-color activated ability. Kenrith, the Return King, which is, I think, trending cheaper now. Kind of a toolbox commander where you can just do a lot of different things.
Some of the more expensive commanders you could put it in are Morphon the Boundless. If you have a 5-color Angel deck, which I have seen them, and they're very good. Morphon is just such a good tribal commander, and I think the fact that this Maelstrom Archangel is now cheap, if you play it in a Morphon deck, you can cast it for free, and that's just insane, and that's really good. Another commander that you can cast it for free or get an immediate payoff for casting it is Ramos Dragon Engine, which buffs itself based on the number of colors and spells you cast, and then if you remove all the counters that it puts on itself, you can add 2 of every mana to your color pool. So if you cast Maelstrom Archangel while Ramos is out on the battlefield, you basically double the mana that you spent on it, and you get the spell for free. So I think there's just a lot of really fun ways to break this card, and I think that once you get on the battlefield and start swinging with it, it can really run away with the game, and I think it's a ton of fun to play. So 5-color budget decks are hard to build, but are doable. You really need to lean a lot into green for your mana fixing. You can play Cultivate and Rampant Growth. But if you lean primarily into green, or if you play something like Golos that lets you tutor out lands under your battlefield, it can really help it so that your budget mana base gets a lot better. You can play some of the gate support like Circuitous Route, or Open the Gates to be able to grab mana and fix it. So really, I think the struggles of building 5-color budget decks are somewhat overstated. There's definitely a lot of issues with them, and there's definitely a lot of things you need to consider. But if you go in with the right mindset, and if you go in and try to build around it using green as the major support card, I think you can get a long distance. Maybe that would be something we can talk about on a future podcast episode.
Yeah.
Who's to say? Number 2.
So this is a card that I don't know that a lot of people are familiar with. Eric, let me ask you this. Do you like Sensei's Divining Top?
Oh, I love Sensei Divining Top. I don't like the price of it, though. Is there anything you can do about that?
Yeah, so this card is called Soothsaying. It's 1 blue mana. It's an enchantment. It has 2 abilities. For 3 and 2 blue, you can shuffle your library. The second ability is pay X. Look at the top X cards of your library, then put them back in any order. Soothsaying is a card from Mercadian Masks, originally printed around 1999. I haven't seen a reprint until today. I think it got up to $7 at one point. Thanks to Mystery Booster, you can get it for about, at least at the time of this podcast, about $1.50. And the reason that I mentioned Sensei's Divining Top, the top lets you rearrange the top 3 cards of your library. With Soothsaying, you can rearrange the top X cards of your library. If you've got a way, even mid late game where there's a lot of mana, you can easily stack the deck, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it turns out you don't like the cards that are coming up, if you have 5 mana, you can just shuffle your library. So the fact that it's only 1 mana is actually really cool. You can get it out pretty early if you want to get it out pretty early. I mean, even for 2 mana, just, it's quite kind of like Scry at that point. Downside is you can't put the card on the bottom.
Right, yeah. So this card actually exploded in price when Yuriko came out, Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow, because that deck really cares about manipulating the top card of your library, and Soothsaying is really good at manipulating the top card of your library. That exploded in price, but with the reprinted mystery boosters, it means that Soothsaying is now really cheap, and I think it's really just good in any deck that wants to be looking at the top card of its library. If you're playing something like Experimental Frenzy or something like Future Sight, where you can look at the top card of the library, Soothsaying lets you rearrange it and be able to cast multiple different things if you end up hitting a land or something that you can't cast. Bolas' Citadel works great with, because you can spend the mana that you're not paying on your spells to rearrange the top card of your library and go off further. So Soothsaying is a really good card. 5 mana to shuffle your library is a bit weird, but it's nice to have that ability. I don't think you should use it that much though. But really you're here for looking at the top X and then rearranging them, which just has so many applications in decks that want to be drawing cards selectively. And I think that Soothsaying is a really good fit for any of them.
There are a handful of commanders that really love this. Commander 18, Commander 19, there was Yenet, which is like that Sphinx, where if the converted mana cost is odd, you can cast it without pain. Elsha, the Infinite, where you can cast the top card of your library if it meets certain criteria. Rashmi.
Played in something like Aminatou, which has an effect that lets you rearrange the top card of your library. Imagine playing this in a deck with miracles and being able to stack any of your miracle spells on the top of your library at any time. So yeah, there's just a lot of really fun applications for the Soothsaying, and it's a really fun card.
I just feel like almost any blue deck, could use it, right? Like you could put it into any blue deck, you'd get utility. It may not be the most powerful card, but when you can sort of look into the future and manipulate that, yeah, that's actually really strong.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a budget version of SDT, Sensei's Divining Top, which a lot of decks want because Sensei's Divining Top is a real good card. So if you're in a deck that wants the top, but you can't run it, then Soothsaying is a perfectly acceptable alternative. Alright, number 1. So our number 1 card is Enchanted Evening, which is 3 mana plus white blue hybrid mana cost. It's from Shadowmoor, I think, which made it have that weird hybrid mana cost, but that's good because it means that you can cast it easier. It's an enchantment, and its effect is all permanents are enchantments in addition to their other types. This is the enchantment equivalent of Mycosynth Lattice, which I think right now is like a $60 card, which is insane. This is much cheaper, and the reprint's driven it down to around $3. And I picked this card as my number 1 because I think it's a card that ended up getting underplayed because of how expensive it was. But now that it's a lot cheaper, I think we can really start exploring the game-winning combos that you can do with such an effect. So at its absolute most fair, it can create very explosive constellation triggers. If you have something like an Eidolon of Blossoms on the battlefield, suddenly playing a land draws you a card, casting a creature draws you a card, casting an artifact draws a card. Anything you do that puts permanents onto the battlefield draws you a card, which is insane, just on itself, and that's its most fair use. If you want to go absurd, this card is an absolute combo machine. If you're playing a card called Aura Thief, which when it dies, takes control of all enchantments your opponent controls, whoops, all their cards are enchantments, suddenly you gain control of all of their permanents. The most typical use of Enchanted Evening is used in a combo with something like Calming Verse or Cleansing Meditation, which is a one-sided enchantment wrath that can destroy all your all of your opponent's non-land permanents, and that just straight up wins you the game, as does Aura Thief. If you play something like Opalescence, it means that all lands are destroyed because they become creatures and they have a cost of 0, so they become 0/0s and die to state-based effects, while also turning every permanent on the battlefield into creatures. If you play something like an Anthem effect along with that, then it saves your lands and wraths all your opponent's stuff, so that can win the game. If you play with something like Ajani's Chosen or Archon of Sun's Grace, which make tokens when enchantments enter the battlefield, those tokens become enchantments, and then you can repeatedly just keep making tokens infinitely. Throw in something like an Impact Tremors, which also got reprinted in Mystery Boosters, that can win you the game. Even like absurd and cards that no one plays in Commander, like something called Scour, which exiles an enchantment, and then you can search your opponent's library for all cards with the same name as that enchantment and remove them from the game. So, obviously, terrible card in Commander, never want to play it, but with Enchanted Evening, exile target basic land, remove all basic lands that have the same name as that land from your opponent's library. Play that against a monocolor deck, and they're out of the game. So this thing just enables absurd combos, and it's tons of fun to play. And that's why it's my number 1 card, because I think that it opens a bunch of possibilities for new win cons and enchantment decks that are white and blue. And it gives you a lot of different fun ways to play the card. So I'm really excited to see this get reprinted and be as cheap as it is, and I hope that we get to see people playing it more, because it's just such a cool combo piece.
I have the Commander, I think it's Commander 18 deck that, like, it's the Bant enchantment deck. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this deck just screams to want to have Enchanted Evening. Tuvasa the Sunlit, where it gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. You've got a lot of enchantresses that are in white and some in green, where when an enchantment enters the battlefield, you can draw cards, you can gain life. Like you were saying earlier, just being able to make everything enchantments. There's actually a handful of cards that, you might open up in a random booster, or, if you were doing an Ikoria draft, that all of a sudden are quite a bit better. Barrier Breach, which is from Ikoria. It's 2 and a green instant, exile up to 3 target enchantments with cycling 2. So cycling, hey, if it's not relevant, you don't have that card Enchanted Evening out, you might still be able to exile some enchantments anyway, but with it out, you just got way more targets, and exile is like the gold standard of removal, right? Yeah, the fact that everything is the same card type means you can manipulate that quite a bit more.
So it's not quite as powerful as Lattice, because I think artifacts are a lot easier to abuse, and there's a lot more one-sided artifact drafts like Vandal Blast. But I think that if you're building a budget deck, and if you have the C18 deck with Estrid, I think that this could be a very valuable card for just closing out the game and winning it in a really quick fashion, and winning it with a very powerful combo, which is something that I think a lot of Enchantress decks really end up needing. They draw a lot of cards, put a lot of permanents on the battlefield, but don't really have a way to win the game very quickly. So I think that if you're in a Bant deck and you want a way to close out the game quickly, I think Enchanted Evening could fit in perfectly there.
Yeah, my advice would be careful on how you use it, because the unwritten rule in Commander is don't mess with people's lands, right? When you start destroying people's lands, people don't want to play with you. Yeah, be a little careful about that. You certainly don't want to lose friends over Magic.
Definitely, yeah. Don't dunk on people unless you have a reason for it, or you can win the game that way. So I think that if you have people in your playgroup that don't scoop to one-sided board drafts that remove all of their permanents from the battlefield, I think that maybe this card wouldn't be worth it, because I think then that card creates a lot of feels bad. But if you have a lot of people in your playgroups that can sort of see the writing on the wall when you do a combo like that, or if you have a lot of tokens on the battlefield via Ajani's Chosen or Archon of Sun's Grace to close out the game, I think that this card is definitely a perfect inclusion.
I'll give you one more card that is rather obscure that people may not be aware of. It's a 13-cent card from Odyssey. It's called Tattoo Ward, which is 2 and a white.
What on earth is Tattoo Ward?
It's an enchanted creature, gets +1/+1, and has protection from enchantments. And you can sack it to destroy an enchantment. So I think of Enchanted Evening. I think, hey, I want to have a Tattoo Ward. Put that on a commander, put that on a big, nice, fat creature. It's super cheap.
Suddenly I have protection from every single enchantment or every single permanent on the battlefield. That's really good. And I really like that. And I think that's a sign of a good card, or at least a good Johnny card, is when you can find a bunch of old, random, obscure cards that absolutely go off in combination. So yeah, really happy to have Enchanted Evening around.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Do you know how many reprints there are in Mystery Boosters without Googling it?
Oh boy. You know what? A standard set. Yeah, a standard set usually has like 250. So I'm gonna go with there's probably more than that.
Yeah, I think that's a good guess.
So maybe about 275.
275. Okay. The Mystery Boosters card pool is 1,694 reprints.
Holy cow.
Insane amount of cards. The reason I bring this up is because obviously we're not going to be able to talk about every single card that got reprinted in mystery boosters. Plenty of awesome cards, plenty of cards available, but we just unfortunately cannot talk about every single one of them. But what we can do, which I thought would be interesting, is that we can go through very quickly, just talk about some of the cards that got their price cut by mystery boosters, and just talk about stuff that we didn't feature in our top 10, but are still things that Commander players should know about that got reprinted and got their prices reduced. And so this lightning round is going to focus more on cards that see a lot of play, but got reprinted in Mystery Booster, which mean that their price got cut, and then we can sort of see them get played more by budget players.
Beast Within and Chaos Warp, two excellent universal permanent removal spells.
In that same vein, we have Darksteel Mutation, Dismember, Shattering Spree, Swords to Plowshares. These are all really good specific removal spells that really efficiently deal with permanents and commanders and a lot of different things.
Bojuka Bog, which is a graveyard hate, and it just being a swamp, you can put it in pretty much any black deck, and you'll get use out of it.
Mizzix's Mastery is an excellent win con for Spellslinger decks. If you're filling up your graveyard with a bunch of different spells, Mizzix's Mastery Overloaded means that you can recast all of them for free, and if you're playing with a Storm win con, you can pretty easily win out the game from there.
All is Dust, which is an excellent colored sweeper. If you have an artifact-heavy deck, or even a colorless deck, this will destroy everything that is not one of those.
And if you're in green that doesn't have a lot of access to mass creature removal, then you can definitely get a lot of use out of this spell. And Wargate lets you tutor your permanents straight from your deck to the battlefield. It's in Bant, which means it's somewhat limited, but if you are in Bant and you want to use this effect, I think it's definitely worth running.
Burnished Heart, one of my favorites. Colorless ramp, you can recur it. Creature that you just sacrifice to get 2 different basic lands.
Cauldron of Souls, which can give all your creatures persist, helps protect against board wipes, and it can also extend your aristocrats plays. So you can give all your creatures persist, sack them all, bring them back, and you can get double triggers on something like a Blood Artist.
Anger, which is a haste enabler. It's essentially, if it's in your graveyard, you get haste. Easy to do, especially in red.
And finally, Mother of Runes is an excellent way to repeatedly protect one of your creatures from targeted removal. It can even protect itself, so if someone's trying to get rid of it, you can pretty easily save it. So yeah, great card. I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, Eric, let me ask you, what decks are you interested in brewing right now?
So there are a lot of commanders that got reprinted in Mystery Boosters. Obviously, a lot of commanders. We didn't get the time to talk about all of them. So what I've been working on is an Animar Kruga deck. And Kruga is a companion from Ikoria that has a companion ability that makes your starting deck contain only cards with converted mana cost 3 or greater and land cards. And when it enters the battlefield, you can draw a card for each other permanent you control that costs more than 3. So I've been working on an Animar Kruga deck that also runs Primal Surge as a win con. So the deck's all entirely permanents. There's a ton of creatures, and there's a ton of easy ways to ramp your commander out and cast a ton of creatures in a turn and just power out a massive board state really quickly. And Kruga lets you redraw all the cards in your hand. I also include a lot of the budget reprints from Mystery Boosters as well, like Knollspine Dragons in there. So yeah, I think it will be a really fun commander deck that is now a lot cheaper thanks to Mystery Boosters.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So Martin, what are you building?
I think it's really cool that we saw Rith the Awakener and then the Pain Artist both released in Mystery Booster. I think you can have a lot of fun with those two. But I am building a Dragonlord Ojutai deck, and I think there's just a lot you can do with it. I think it's relatively inexpensive to put together, and it's easy for people to play. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to having that built here, and I'll have a link to the deck list as well.
All right. Excellent. So, we're living in rough times. Rough times and interesting times as Commander players. And as Magic players, we have to quarantine as a part of this whole thing, which I'm kind of shocked we managed to go this entire podcast without talking about it. But yeah, this podcast is getting recorded while we are still in quarantine. And it's really hard to play paper Magic with people, especially because we're getting a lot of really cool cards getting printed in Ikoria, Commander 2020, Mystery Boosters. We're getting a lot of really cool cards printed that are now getting a lot cheaper, and we just don't have the ability to go out and play with people. So I think that this is really an important time to, save your money, obviously. And I think that the fact that a lot of these cards are getting cheaper means that we can still maintain our hobby and get ready for when the quarantine gets lifted and be able to go back and play with our friends and family. Budget brewing is more important than ever, and I think that Mystery Boosters is really good because it gives us an outlet to do so.
Well said. And, honestly, if you're stuck and you don't have a chance to play with people, now's the best time to brew that deck. A lot of times I'll notice that, Friday Night Magic is coming up or Commander Night's coming up, and it's a scramble. I'll realize, oh shoot, I wanted to put these few cards in, or oh shoot, I hadn't whittled it, my cards down, they're not sleeved. Like, now's your chance to you can take your time and put together a couple decks. Local game stores start opening up again. You'll be ready to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also when the quarantine does get lifted and we are returning to your LGSs, I think it's also important to be buying from LGSs and supporting them during this time. A lot of the people who own LGSs have that as their main source of income. Buy a commander deck from them, or maybe pick up a few singles, or splurge a little bit. Obviously, don't splurge if you don't have the money to do so, but I think it's really important right now to find different ways to support LGSs.
All right, well, I think that does it for this episode. We'll come back in the future here, talk more about some of the new cards that have come out. We'll try to talk about Commander 2020 and Ikoria and other things. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you for now.
Yep, see you guys later.